Hello, and welcome to Office Hours with Dr. Dan. I'm Dan. Today's topic is what I call teaching style, which is how to conduct yourself and teach your courses. So, disclaimer again, all of my experience as both a professor and a student has been in the United States. So some of these pieces of advice may not translate well overseas. So again, take what you can from my information and tailor it to your specific situation. Also, it's going to be a fairly long video, probably about an hour or so, and a lot of points. So down below in the description is information on how you can get my talking points. So take a look down there. That way you can go and download and print out the talking points ahead of time, or you can have them for future reference. So my overarching philosophy that covers a lot of this, or backs up a lot of this, is your students are adults. This is college. It's not high school or elementary school. It's college. Your students are adults. They need to act like adults, and you need to treat them like adults. So they need to take an active role in their education. They need to show some initiative. It's our job to teach, their job to learn. Again, we can do badly at teaching, and there are some bad professors out there, but then there are some lazy students out there who don't put the time in to learn what they need to learn. So again, my overarching philosophy is we're teaching adults. Those students need to take an active role in their education. And of course, the larger your classes are, the harder it's going to be to give anyone any kind of individual attention. So hopefully if you have a large class, your school has made some teaching assistants available so that the students can go and talk to people and get some help. If they can't do that, then again, them being adults, there's a lot of other resources out there that they can go to and that should go to if they need help in the learning environment, and we'll cover that later. First off, one of the things, if you're going in a new professor, how do you want your students to address you? Is it going to be Dr., Mr., Ms., Mrs., whatever is the appropriate title? My philosophy when I was teaching was I preferred my students to address me by my first name. Again, I was an adjunct, so I was just there to teach. I wasn't a full-time professor. I'm bringing in the business perspective, because in business in the United States, overarchingly, it's first names. When you go to work, you're not calling your boss Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. You're addressing your boss by their first name. They're addressing you by your first name, and that goes on up higher up the chain of command. So in the academic environment, students don't necessarily see this because it's Dr. so-and-so, Professor so-and-so, Dean so-and-so, Chancellor so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. And that's fine for that environment, but when they get out into the business world, they need to realize that it's first names. And just because you're on first name basis with somebody does not mean that you're friends, that you don't have this over familiarity with people. So just getting them into that habit of, it's like, okay, you can address some of your professors by their first name because that's what they prefer. But again, that doesn't mean you're friends. And so when they get out into the business world, they realize that, okay, first names is just how it is. And then we go to, well, how will you address your students? Again, Mr., Ms., Mrs., whatever else there is, or by their first name. So again, some of this is cultural, and that's going to be the norm of what you do. Again, the larger the class is, the harder it's going to be to learn names. I'm not the best at learning names, unfortunately. So the smaller the class, the easier it is to learn names. If you get there and it's the middle of the semester and you should probably know someone's name, but you don't, just, if you have to talk with them, just say, remind me your name, I'm having a bad day, something like that, so you can talk to somebody and use their name and not be dancing around everything because you don't want to admit that, well, it's the middle of the semester, I probably should know your name by now, but I don't. Are you going to take attendance in your classes? Are you required to take attendance? So if you're required to take attendance, then obviously that's something you're going to have to do. And how are you going to do that? Are you going to stand in the front of the class and take roll and check things off of a sheet? That takes time, but it is a good way to get to learn people's names. Are you going to pass a sheet around for people to sign in? That's quicker, but then again, people can sign in for their friends that aren't going to be there. So it's one of those things. How important is it that attendance is accurate? Because if you're going to include attendance in your final grade, then you don't necessarily have to take attendance every single time, as long as you let students know ahead of time that there's going to be some days that I take attendance in class, and those are the days that are going to be used to figure out your grade for attendance as it figures into the final grade. And if you just happen to miss that one day that attendance is taken, or one of the days that attendance is taken, well, that's life. Are you going to assign seats or let students pick? It's college. Very rarely have I ever run across, I've never run across where any of my professors said, you will sit here. I had a few that would say, pick where you want to sit, and then that's going to be your seat for at least the first few weeks of class, because then they would hand around a sheet that everyone would fill out so that the professor would have it, and they could have that up at the front of class, and they could know who to call on. So that helped them learn people's names, and as it got farther along the semester, if you wanted to switch seats, you could. I mean, in general, it's been my experience that students tend to self-assign seats. They get into class, they pick out their seat, and then that's pretty much where they want to sit the rest of the time. And if someone comes in and sits in their seat somewhat later, then there's generally a little friction that goes on. So students will generally self-assign. So if you want to try to learn people's names, one of the things you can do is let them pick their seats, pass around a chart, fill it out, and then use that to learn people's names. Again, if you have a class of 500 students, the odds of you learning everyone's name is pretty low, but if you can, so much the better. Are you going to let late arrivals in the class? So again, this is going back to your reputation or your philosophy. So if class starts at 8 o'clock, are you going to not let people in after that? If you're going to start locking doors on that, remember, people need to be able to get out in the event of emergency, so don't lock people in. Just keep that in mind. But, again, if you're not going to let people in, you need to let them know that at the beginning of the semester. It's like, hey, class starts at 8. We start at 8. If you're not here by 8, don't bother coming in. And one of the things I did would have a very short quiz at the beginning of class. So if you have a quick 10-minute quiz, nothing major, just something about either a point you covered in the last class meeting or something that you're going to cover in this meeting that they were supposed to read about. If you give them that quick quiz and say it's, class starts at 8, we start the quiz at 8, it's 10 minutes long. If you come in at 8:05, you've got 5 minutes instead of 10. If you come in at 8:11, then you missed the quiz. That's just how it goes. One thing, quiz is not something you do for punishment. A nice thing about a quiz is it gives some immediate feedback to, are the students understanding what you were covering? If you had a topic that you covered in your previous lecture, you have a quiz on that topic and 80% of the students get it wrong, then that tends to say, okay, the professor didn't cover that topic adequately, and you need to go back and address that topic again. Are you going to let food or drink in the classroom? Some schools just may have a blanket policy, absolutely not, it is forbidden, and that kind of solves that, other than, are you going to be one to enforce that? It's kind of annoying that you have to be the professor, you're there to teach, and you have to start trying to enforce the eating or drinking rules, but that may be part of your job. If you're allowed to have the option of having food or drink in the class, are you going to allow that? And my rule was, I generally didn't care as long as it wasn't disruptive. If they're bringing in something that's very smelly, whether it smells bad or it smells good, that's going to distract students, that was not okay. If they have a bag of chips and they're crunching that bag, rattling that bag, crunching the chips, then that's not acceptable. If they're slurping their drink, what have you. So they need, if you're gonna allow it, it needs to be something that's not going to cause a disruption. If the students make a mess, then they need to clean it up. It's not the custodial staff's job to pick up something that the students are being slobs. And are you going to drink during class? And I'm not talking popping open a beer or anything like that. I'm just, if you're going to have water or tea or something to keep your voice going if you have a particularly long lecture. So it's kind of bad if you are up there drinking and not allowing the students to do that. So keep that in mind. On that note, if you have a long class, say you've got a class that meets for 3 hours once a week, and I had several of those, then generally it's a good idea to have a little break in there where students can have a quick snack, use the restroom, just get up and stretch, because 3 straight hours of listening to anyone talk, no matter how dynamic that speaker, no matter how interesting the subject, can just be a long grind. So if you have a long class period, give students a break, and then again, make sure they come back on time. Maybe you need to have, instead of a quiz at the beginning of class, sometimes you have a quiz after the mid-class break just to get everyone back on time. How are you going to dress for class? Maybe your school has rules that have some kind of a dress code for professors. Maybe they leave it completely up to you. So are you going to be the suit and tie, pantsuit kind of professor? Or are you going to be the flip-flop jeans and tie-dyed shirt kind of professor? It really depends. How do you dress for work? I'm a jeans and collared shirt kind of person. I do own some ties. I do remember how to tie them, but it's very, very, very rare that I will ever put one of those on. So figure out how you're going to dress. I know some of my professors that I had, they would always come in dressed very nicely, some fairly expensive clothes. That was just who they were, whereas others would come in a collared shirt and jeans. I never saw a professor come in a t-shirt. And if they were in jeans, the jeans were not ratty type of jeans. If you're a teaching assistant, then obviously your wardrobe's probably not going to be what your professor's wardrobe is. So just make sure that however you're going to come to class is approved by your professor. You're basically who's your boss. If you're teaching a lab, then obviously there's going to be some dress requirements for the lab, so make sure you keep that in mind. Are you going to rely heavily on the textbook, or is the textbook just going to be kind of an extra reference, or are you even going to have a textbook? Textbooks are expensive, I grant you that, but a well-written textbook used correctly can greatly add to the class because it puts all the information there in one place. The student's kind of a one-shop stop instead of having to go pull a bunch of journal articles out. So undergrad, the textbook is very important. For graduate classes, a lot of times the textbook is your notes or things that you've put together, or maybe there's a textbook that covers part of the subject matter and then you have to go for outside sources after that. And do your students really need the most recent edition of the textbook? Meaning, publishers come out, they make changes to the textbooks, they add or take out things, they reformat things, and previous editions, which contain almost all of the same information, become a whole lot cheaper than the new edition. So my thing was, the few classes I taught that actually had textbooks where the editions switched between times that I taught the class, I would teach primarily from the newest edition of the textbook, but I would let my students know that if they could find the old edition of a textbook, that was fine with me. I didn't care. If I assigned homework from the new textbook, they needed to make sure they were working the correct problem, because the textbook changes that they made for my class that I was teaching were more formatting, and the minor amount of information change did not justify the $100+ difference in price between new textbook and old edition. So, as a professor, you're probably going to be required by the university to teach from the new edition, but if your students can use the old edition and not affect their learning experience. If all they're going to have to do is just make sure that they're working the right problems from the new textbook, then give them that option if you're allowed. Even if you're not allowed, is someone going to come in and check that. Are you going to make your course notes available, or are you going to expect your students to transcribe what you're taking down? There's kind of a balance of that. If you give them everything and say, hey, here's my notes, here's everything I'm going to talk about, then that kind of encourages you people to skip class or not really pay attention. Whereas if you're giving them nothing, then they're madly scribbling, and are they missing key points because they're so worried about writing things down that they're missing key points. So it's kind of a double-edged sword and some kind of balance that you have to come with, and that's really from experience. The more times you teach a class, the more you'll know what you need to give. I mean, if your notes are basically a summary of what's in the textbook, then that's great. Then it's like, hey, you have the textbook. All you need to do is, I'm not a big fan of highlighting because that tends to delay learning. It's, I'll highlight this and go back and learn it later. But if they're making notes on the important parts, the things that you're really stressing, then that helps them focus on the pertinent topics, and they're not just madly writing and then missing things. And how are you going to conduct your lectures? Are you going to do the old-fashioned chalk or dry erase board? Are you going to do computer slides or videos or whatever the latest technology is? The nice thing about chalk or dry board versus the computer slides, if you've got everything on slides, it's too easy for you to just start tapping and waving your hands and moving too quickly, which can get students lost. Now, if you've got the slides and you're providing the students the slides ahead of time so that, again, they can follow along, they can make annotations, that's one thing. But if the students don't have access to the slides and they're trying to get down the pertinent information, again, particularly if there's not a textbook for the class, then there's this, it's the equivalent of the old days when a professor would be writing on the board with one hand and coming along and erasing right behind themselves. Never saw that happen in real life, so maybe that's an urban legend. If you want to use videos, if you've got something that you've made up previously, or you've gone and found something on the internet that you're allowed to use, for my for my materials class that I taught, I would go and find videos online on how cement was made or how steel was made, and have the students watch those prior to class. So if we're talking about the physical properties of steel, they've seen a video on how steel was made. And if you go and look online and watch a video of how steel was made in the 40s and 50s, it's like, oh my God, no wonder we have OSHA, because there's all these folks there in fedora hats and long sleeve regular street type clothes with all these sparks and molten slags popping around all over the place. It's like, no wonder that was just such a crazy, dangerous business to be in, and thankfully we've made some progress on workplace safety since then. Whatever latest technology may come up to help you teach the class, don't let the flash of that technology override the message that you're trying to get across or the information you're trying to get across. I mean, if you can have some 3D holographic holodeck kind of thing, great, but is the information that is being presented by that technology correct and accurate and understandable? So just because the technology is out there doesn't mean it's necessarily the best way to teach that material. Are you going to allow students to record or video your classes? Particularly if the student is not a native speaker of whatever language the class is taught in, if they want to have a recording device up there so that they could go back later and listen and pick out the important words that they may not have grasped immediately. That's, maybe your school has policies that say they have to be allowed to do that, they can't do that. And one of the things you have to look at is what kind of class are you teaching? Again, I teach engineering, so as far as the free exchange of ideas, there's really not going to be much of anything someone's going to say that's going to be outlandish, that's going to be offensive or whatnot, that if, hey, there's something up there recording that's going to diminish the free exchange of ideas. If you're in a political science class or a theology class or something, then things could be a whole lot different, where that's like, oh, this is being recorded, so everyone's going to just, keep their mouth shut because they don't want to risk saying something that's going to get put out there. That's good and bad, because that might keep someone from saying something horrendously offensive, and there you go. But that's something you may have to think about. It's better to know what your policy is ahead of time than, boom, someone comes up and plops a tape recorder on your desk or the lectern, and now you have to determine in the middle of, right at the beginning of class, are you going to allow that to happen or not? One of the things, you always need to assume that someone's recording you. Again, as an engineer, teaching engineering classes, not really anything you can say that's going to be, oh my gosh, so out there that anyone's going to care what you're saying. But you always need to think before you're speaking and be careful about that. Are you going to let your students use electronics in class to take notes? I mean, no, you don't want them surfing the internet or texting on the phone and all that, but if they come in with a laptop or a tablet or something, that's how they take their notes, is that something you're going to allow? And if multiple students are doing that, and are there the outlets available? Do they need to come in with a charged battery? How is all that going to work? So just something to think about. And again, it's the overarching thing of, are students having electronics in the class going to be disruptive to everybody else? So bear that in mind. And another thing, are you going to call on students in the class? Are you going to physically point to somebody and say, hey, Jimmy or Jane, what is the answer to this question? Or are you going to send them to the board to work out a problem? It's one of those things that asking someone a question, or the students knowing that they could be called on, is one way to keep them on their toes, keep them involved in the class rather than just kind of drifting off, because if they just know they're going to just have to show up and write down, they're never going to be called on, there's that tendency to drift off. But if they know, hey, Professor so-and-so calls on people, I need to pay attention. Questions aren't punishment, though. I mean, one of the things with questions is it keeps the class engaged. If there's a difficult point that you want to make sure students are getting, if you ask the question, excuse me, and they get it, that's good. I mean, if it's one of these things where you can go by show of hands, who thinks this, who thinks that, then you can get some very good immediate feedback of whether they've grasped the topic. Because a lot of times you ask students, okay, any questions, everyone okay? There's just either the blank stares or people are going like this. If you got a bunch of people going like this, meaning no, they don't get it, okay, they're giving you some feedback, go back and re-hit the point. But a lot of times students are just going to want to get through the class as quick as they can, because they think, oh, well, if we get through all this material, then maybe they'll let us out early. So one of the rare cases people don't want to get everything they've paid for when it's class. It's like, oh, can we get out of class early, as opposed to, oh, we paid this money to go see a movie, and it's like, oh, what, we don't get to see the whole movie? So are you going to tell jokes and stories? Again, you're not there to be a stand-up comic by any stretch of the imagination. But if you, again, keep the students engaged, keep them interested in what you have to say. If you're going to tell jokes, I mean, engineer humor, it's kind of dry, I grant you. If you're going to make fun of somebody, you make fun of yourself. You don't tell any kind of jokes that are going to disparage one group or another. I mean, obviously, if you teach at one school and then you've got the big arch nemesis rival is another school, then yeah, okay, you're going to tell jokes about that. But if you're going to make fun of somebody, you're going to make fun of yourself. As those of you may be able to tell from the camera, I have more than a little extra weight that I'm carrying around. So when I'm talking about stress And strain in an engineering class, I usually throw something, well, it's like if I'm walking across this field, there's going to be a lot of stress on the soil or something like that. Again, you're making fun of yourself, not in a bad or derogatory or nasty way. It's just, again, keeping students engaged. And then also there's the stories. If you have you're not telling them a bedtime story, you're telling them something about your work or your research that is pertinent to the lecture. Again, as a practicing engineer, teaching engineering to college students, to me it was important to bring in real world examples. Like, here's something that happened at work that directly corresponds to what we're studying today. So yes, this is something that engineers actually use. So again, when you're teaching classes, a lot of times with students, it's like, well, am I ever going to use this? And it's like, we don't know. I mean, maybe you're going to use it, maybe you're not going to use it. Did I think that I was ever going to go get a PhD and study pavement or soil compaction? No, but things have a way of being different. So maybe your students will use what you teach them, maybe they won't. It's just one of those things. Going on that, how much of your personal life are you going to share? I mean, you're there to educate, not indoctrinate. So again, depending on what you're teaching, whether you bring in your personal life, if you have, teaching engineering and you're talking about something that was going on with your house, that, well, maybe your students are going to buy a house sometime and that's something they should look for. If you're teaching psychology and you have a friend or something that was experienced whatever psychoses or neuroses that you're talking about, and again, keeping that friend's privacy intact, you can talk about things like that. So will the information keep the class engaged and interested? And then it's okay, consider sharing that again within the bounds of certain things. My students know that they're more likely to find me in front of a video game console than they are to find me at the gym, hence, this. How will you handle social media? I mean, there's all of, Facebook, Twitter, and whatever else is going to be out there in years to come. How much of your life personal life do you want your students to have access to? My philosophy was as little as possible. Frankly, I do not have much of a presence on social media. That's just the way it is. My general rule was, once my students graduated and then they became colleagues, fellow engineers, then it's like, okay, well, I'll bring you into my LinkedIn network or this, that, or the other thing. So just be careful how much you share on social media that is public, that your students are going to see, particularly if you're a teaching assistant or a younger professor. Your students really need to see you out there at a bar doing shots, pictures of things like that. So one of the things, if you're going to apply for jobs, scrub your social media as much as you can before you start going to apply. Again, this is more for TAs wanting to be professors, because now it's really easy to just type someone's name into a search engine and boom, 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 see what comes up. How often will you check and respond to students' emails? So if you say, okay, students, I have office hours, you can come by in office hours, you can email me. Are you going to be checking that every day? Are you going to be checking that the couple hours before class or whatnot? So some students may get to things like, well, I sent you an email an hour ago, why haven't you responded to it? So let them know, here's generally when I will check emails as best I can. And as a professor, you don't have to respond to every single student email. If a student comes in or sends an email and asks a question that you wouldn't answer if they came to office hours, like, well, what's the answer to this homework problem that's due in 3 days? Well, you don't have to respond to that question. I mean, just because a student sends you an email does not mean you have to respond to it unless your school has some rule about that. So just realize you have to guard your time, and again, the students are adults, so let them know how often you will check email and that you may not respond to every single email. Are you going to allow students to stop by your office whenever they want whenever you're around, or just during office hours. So obviously, you may or may not have to have office hours. The school I taught at, we were required to have an office hour, so we had to have office hours. If it was a 3 credit hour class, we had to have 6 hours of office hours during the week, and we had to post them, and we were expected to be there or in the immediate area. So if I was going to use that office hours time to get some lab stuff together, as long as the students knew where to find me, that was fine. I wasn't chained to my desk for office hours. Or can you have virtual office hours where students can go online and you can have a FaceTime chat or exchange text messages or whatnot? Are you going to be a professor that gives lots of homework, or minimal homework, or no homework, or is homework just kind of, well, here's some problems that if you want to look at and work, they'll help you understand the material, but I'm not going to collect them and grade them. So you kind of have to look at, are there expectations at your school that you have to give homework? And as far as giving an inordinate amount of homework, the old rule of working on the class 3 hours per every hour you spent, it's working the same type of problem over and over and over and over again when the student already has mastered that problem is not doing anybody any good, because someone's going to have to grade those. So it's a balance of assigning relevant homework problems and giving relevant assignments that are going to help the students learn the material without overburdening them, because your class is not the only class they have, most likely. Your class may not be the most important they have during that semester. I know I would always tell my students, and especially if I got to teach the freshmen, freshmen, the most important civil engineering class you're going to have is statics, because statics builds on everything else, builds on statics as far as structures, mechanics of materials, and stress strain analysis. So that is the most important civil engineering class you'll ever take. The most important class for your professional life that you'll ever take is English, grammar, and composition, followed a close second by public speaking. So none of those were classes that I taught. So you have to balance this on, or well, you don't have to do anything, it's up to you, but you should balance the amount of work the student has in the class with the credit hours. If you're teaching a 1 credit hour class, you shouldn't be given the same amount of homework that you would for a 3 credit hour class. And again, the homework should be relevant. Are you going to use some of the time at the beginning of class to go over homework? Are you going to go over homework in class? Or are you just going to hand it back and students come in during office hours to do that? If you're grading your own homework, or your graders tell you that a majority of students are having a problem with a specific homework problem or an assignment, that may be worth then going back over to reinforce the point. I never had graders because I always had reasonably small classes, so I could see what problems the students were having, where do I need to go back and check. So that's one of the advantages of doing your own grading. Yes, it can stink, but you get some immediate feedback on where students are having problems. Excuse me. Are you going to count homework towards the final grade? Sometimes professors do, sometimes they don't. How much of a percent? Is it 10% of the final grade is based on your homework? Is it 30%? One of my professors, if he took the homework in, graded it, and you either got a check or a check minus. And he'd record that in his grade book, and at the end of the semester, he'd look at what your grades were from the tests, the midterm, final, and whatever other tests. And if you were on the border between one grade or next and you had a bunch of check pluses for your homework, then he'd bump you up. Otherwise, he wouldn't. So that's one way to do that. It's something you have to determine. How are you going to handle homework? Are you going to accept late homework? Are you going to require all the homework to be turned in before the end of the year? So we're on part 3, so there was a little bit of a camera error, so just going to jump back in to homework, so it'll be a little bit of a review of some of the topics that were covered at the end of part 2. Like I say, these are one-take videos, so I'm not going to do a bunch of video editing. So where I left off end of part 2 was, are you going to require all of the homework to be submitted for the student to get a final grade? It's like, even if it's the last week of the year, do they have to have everything submitted? You're not going to get a grade for anything that's late, but are you going to require that they submit that? And on the aspect of late homework, are you going to accept late homework for points? If it's due at noon on Monday and they turn it in at 1 o'clock on Monday, are you going to accept the homework with a reduction in points? Is there a limit to when this homework will be accepted? In general, if the homework has been graded and passed back, that is the absolute, should be the absolute cutoff for the student being allowed to turn in and still receive points. Because once the homework's handed back, like I say, we'd all like to believe that there isn't anybody copying homework, but that happens. Another thing is, are you going to show up to class early to answer questions? That's one of the things. If you have time to do that, if the classroom is open enough. I mean, some professors, there may be 20 minutes between the end of their class and the start of the follow-on class. Some professors like to use that whole extra 20 minutes, and you may have to go in and kick them out, and as a junior faculty member to have to ask a senior faculty member to leave because you have a test starting that period in 2 minutes and they still want to continue on their lecture. That's when you have to be like, look, we've got a test. This coming period, my class starts in 2 minutes. I need the room. So, be ready for that. And you'll know very early on in the semester whether the professor in front of you is one that keeps things going until the very end, or if they're one that the class ends at noon, they end at noon. If you want to answer questions at the beginning of period, that's great. If you want to say, I'm only going to answer questions in office hours, that's an option. Answering questions in front of everyone can be way more efficient than having everyone in the class show up to office hours asking the same question, which also brings the point, if you have 3, 4, 5 people coming in asking the same question, whether it's about a homework problem or a topic, then that's some immediate feedback of, well, maybe I better cover that topic a little more at the beginning of the next class period. One thing you want to be careful of is spending too much time at the beginning of a class period answering questions, or too much time in the class period answering questions where you don't get through everything you want to cover. Because it's too easy to get off track, and boom, halfway through the semester, you're like only a quarter of the way through the material that you have to cover. So then boom, if there's requirements that you cover all of these certain topics to for that class to be valid, then there's some problems. So it's incumbent upon you as the professor to make sure that you keep the class on track. What is your policy for covering material if a student misses class? If they have either an excused or an unexcused absence, are you going to go over the whole lecture during office hours? If the lecture's recorded, then obviously they can go watch that. But even if a student has an excused absence, it is not necessarily your responsibility to cover the entire lecture, to repeat the entire lecture to a student that missed a class. If they come to you with specific questions, fine. If they come to you expecting you to spend all of this time, they missed a 1-hour lecture because they had an excused absence, that you have to go through that whole lecture with them. Again, that's unrealistic. My philosophy was, look, if you miss class, whether an excused or unexcused absence, you get with someone that you know in the class to get the notes, whatever wasn't passed out, and you go over that, and if you have questions, then you come to see me with specific questions, not, I don't understand this, explain the whole lecture to me. Again, because there's only a certain amount of hours in a day, and the bigger your class and the more students that miss, and then them coming to you expecting you to redo the whole lecture is just not realistic on anybody's part. How do you handle minor disruptions in class? Someone's cell phone goes off in class, or they drop something, or they're creating a ruckus with a potato chip bag or something. Just be careful about creating a bigger disruption trying to calm something down. I mean, at some point, someone's going to forget to turn off their cell phone. It may be you that forgets to turn off your cell phone. What I would have in my syllabus or tell students at the beginning of the class is, look, phones need to go off. If you forget, then silence it as quick as you can without making a big commotion. Do not answer it in class. That would be inappropriate. Again, they're not there to speak on their phone during class. Again, it's what's going to cause a bigger disruption. So handle things in a way that's going to diffuse the situation as quickly as possible and not escalate it to where you've got a big brouhaha going on. If you're like, oh, well, I'm going to take that cell phone for the rest of the semester, yeah, good luck doing that with an adult. I mean, if that's the university's policy, yeah, but do you really want to go up to one of your adult students and try to wrestle their cell phone out of their hand if they're not willing to give it up? Again, it's college, not elementary school. If there's someone that is continually not turning off their cell phone, then you have whatever disciplinary actions that you have available to you, and that depends on the wherever you're teaching and what you can and cannot do with a disruptive student. Basically, my advice was I ignored what I could. If it was not really causing disruption, if someone forgot to turn their cell phone off and it rang and they silenced it, you could tell they were embarrassed, and just let it go. Just get back to your lecture. How will you administer your tests and quizzes? I mean, the physical logistics of it. My advice is to sit in the back of the room and walk around during a class so that you are available if students have questions, but then you can also keep an eye out for anybody who's doing something that they shouldn't be doing. Will you let your students come in late to a quiz or test or exam? Again, have it in the syllabus. If class starts at 8 o'clock or the final exam starts at 8, realistically for midterm and final, as important as those are, you probably want to have a little bit of a leeway on that, because if 8 o'clock comes along and someone's 8 o'clock and 30 seconds coming in and you're not going to let them take the final, that can be a bit rough. But it's it's your class, it's what you're allowed to do and what you're willing to fight for. If a student misses a test or a quiz due to an excused or unexcused absence, what is your policy on that? If it's unexcused absence, are you going to let them make it up? The university may have a policy on that. Universities will generally have a policy on excused absences. You have to make some arrangements. Unexcused, it's generally more up to what the professor wants to do. Making and scheduling a makeup exam can be a real pain, particularly if there's 2 or 3 or more people who missed the test and then you're trying to get everyone's schedule lined up. My philosophy or my procedure was, if you missed a test with an excused absence, then the final exam would count for what you missed plus the final exam, because I was not going to make up and administer an extra test. It just was not going to happen. That was what I did, and students knew that at the beginning, so that puts a lot more onus on the final exam. The final exam may turn out to be 60% of their grade if they've missed either the one. I usually had at least 3 tests during a semester for a 3 credit hour class. It wasn't just a midterm and the final. There were usually 3 tests, and the final was just like a 3rd test. It may be comprehensive to the extent that they had to know everything or have a familiarity with everything we learned before. But be that as it may, that I was not going to make up a bunch of extra tests. If someone's going to miss and they know ahead of time, I would not let that person take the test ahead of time, because you're either going to have to make up another test or everybody is going to be on that person. It's like, oh, well, you took the test, what's on it? Don't put that person in that position. Again, I realize some schools have honor codes and all that kind of fun thing. It's like, oh, well, our students aren't going to do that. Yeah, we have laws and people break laws, and honor code is a rule, not a law. So keep that in mind. Are you going to let people out of the class once the test or quiz starts? My rule was, once the test or quiz starts, if you leave, you're done. So If you're not feeling well that day, then you need to go to the doctor. I mean, I wasn't going to physically restrain anybody and keep them in the room, but once they left, they were done with the test or quiz, because it's too much of a thing that someone could be cheating. You need to watch that. Are you going to be an open book or closed book person? Again, depends on the class you're teaching. Have never been a fan of memorizing formulas, because in the practicing engineering world, we don't have to memorize formulas. The formulas that we use day in and day out, we'll memorize. Formulas that we don't use very often, we'll go look up. That's what books and internet websites are for. So just keep that in mind. That's one of your options. Are you going to have a formula sheet? Are you going to provide the formula sheet, or are you going to have one of the students write the formula sheet and you review and say, okay, this is a good or not good formula sheet? And are you going to provide it ahead of time? My advice is to provide it ahead of time so students know what formulas they will be given. And if they think they're going to need something else, then they can memorize that or bring it up. Well, hey, what about this formula? And if you're writing the formula sheet, obviously you're not just going to include just exactly what they're going to need on it. You're going to include additional information, and they should probably need to know the nomenclature themselves. Like, you're not going to have a formula with each individual term defined, or what A equals acceleration, V equals velocity. They need to know what those terms mean. If you're not going to do a formula sheet, are you going to have a page or a note card of notes? My feeling on that is it's kind of one of those things of whoever can write the smallest wins, and I would require those to be handwritten, because someone can go in and shrink things down really, really teeny tiny, and young eyes are generally much better than older eyes. So if someone can just squeeze everything down, and are you going to let them have solved problems on that or not? And I would always say that they would need to turn that back in. So I was not a note card or page of notes. I was going to give, here is the formula sheet you're going to have. If there is something that you think that is very important that they have memorized, there were a couple occasions in geotechnical engineering where there's some things that the students needed to have memorized, and I would cover that in a quiz, or at the beginning of classes, like, here's part A of the test, this is closed book, closed notes. When you're finished with that, turn it in and you get the second part of the test, which has the formula sheet attached to it. So that gets to be a little bit more of a pain from a logistical standpoint, and in a much bigger classroom setting, that's probably going to be difficult to do, but it's definitely more of an option in a smaller setting. So, are you just going to have the midterm or the final? Are you going to have multiple tests? Is the final going to be comprehensive, or just really like a third or fourth test? Again, figure out what you want to do and let the students know. Are you going to let the students keep your tests and quizzes and homework after you grade them? Because realize every single thing you give back to your students is going to be available for future generations of students. Some organizations keep files. Now they can scan them and put them in a PDF and keep them out there on some website someplace. So everything that you pass back to your students is going to be available for future students. So you need to keep that in mind when you are making up tests. And if you are using publisher-provided tests or questions, if they have a test bank of 500 questions and you're going to have a test of 50 of those, realize that those test bank questions are going to be out there on the internet at some point, if they're not already. So consider making up a few questions of your own, maybe enough to, if all someone's done is gone out and memorized the test bank questions, that if that's all they've done, they're not going to be able to get an A unless they know how to answer the questions that you developed. So if you're just going to use stuff that the publisher has provided, realize that's going to be out there on the internet. I realize that that's violating copyright law and that's academic dishonesty, but it's something that's going to happen. Do you want to have to deal with that? Are you going to have specific policies for seating during test days? I would have, every other seat had to be open, everything had to be on the floor, blah, blah, blah. It's one of those things that, again, if you have a huge class and it's packed, you're not going to be able to do that. And larger the class is, the more you need to have help to keep an eye on things during the test. Are you going to limit the types of calculators students can use? One, you should never allow a student to use the calculator on their cell phone. One, for engineering classes, that's not going to be a powerful enough calculator probably, but then they'd have access to the internet and everything like that, so standalone calculators. Are you going to be a partial credit professor? So if you have something that it's, a test that you give true, false, fill in the blank, multiple choice, then partial credit's not really an issue. But for the engineering type classes and other classes, there are opportunities usually for partial credit. In real life, there is partial credit. It's not all or nothing. If you are designing a building, yes, obviously the building has to stand, but if there's a little oopsie in the plans, that can be corrected. That may cost some money. But are the students getting the main topics down? If they're just like totally out of the range of reality, then okay, lose everything. My philosophy is also, if you don't show your work, you're not going to get credit even if you get the right answer. So if there's a formula that you have to have, the formula need to be written out, you need to put in all the proper numbers, you need to have, your answer had to have units. So look at that with as far as partial credit goes. Will you offer extra credit for the final grade? My first semester there, I wasn't going to offer extra credit. And then, of course, at the end of the semester, there's people coming up that they say, oh, I need to get such and such in this class, keep my scholarship, and blah, blah, blah. So fortunately, they came to me early enough in the semester that I was like, okay, I relented and came up with some extra credit that I had to make available to everybody. You cannot do for one person what you do not give everybody else the opportunity to accomplish as well. So you can't just give one person the opportunity to do extra credit without giving everybody the opportunity to do extra credit. So my advice would be to have something in the syllabus at the beginning of the semester is here's how extra credit can be earned. Mine was they had to get an article about an engineering failure or engineering topic relevant to what the class was that I was teaching. So if it was geotechnical engineering, they had to come up with some kind of geotechnical problem. If it was systems engineering, they had to come up with a paper on systems engineering, and it had to be approved ahead of time. And then they had 400 or 800 words, and it wasn't just a book report. It's okay, here's what the main topics of this article were and a reaction to it. And if they did everything, and grammar and punctuation and spelling and all that counted, if they did it well, then that would be up to 1 percentage point added to their final grade, and you could do that a maximum of 5 times. And in 5 years or 10 semesters of teaching, I probably had 5 people take advantage of that. So it's there. It's not something that's easy, but it's something that is doable. What are your cutoff for grades going to be? Is it 90, 80, 70, 60? Do you have plus grades? Are you going to round an 88 up to an A? What are you going to do? If your school does not have plus and minus grades, once you become a bigwig on the faculty senate, it would probably be a nice thing to push for, because someone that gets an 88 and gets a B has done much better in the class than someone that gets a 79 rounded up to 80 and goes from a C to B. That 88 person has generally learned more than the 79 person, yet they're going to get the same grade points. So whatever your cutoff's going to be, and then is there some room? It's like 90, 80, 70, 60, those are the minimums, but if you've got a bunch of people clustered around 89, 90, 91, are you going to say, well, okay, I'm going to circle all these and they're going to get an A, and then here's the person down at 86? Well, that's a solid B. One of the things, are you going to do a reverse class or normal class? And reverse class is the students watch videos of the lecture ahead of time, and then the actual classroom time is devoted to problem solving, answering questions about homework and things like that. And in theory, that sounds great. The issue that comes up with is, are you going to have time to make the videos? Has someone made the videos for you? Will your students actually watch the videos? Because if they don't watch the videos ahead of time, then the working problems and answering questions is just really not going to work out. So there's a lot of different things that go into what I call your teaching style. It's how you're going to run the class. Are you going to be all the way, hard nose over here or over here, kind of, not anywhere near that hard nose, kind of familiar with the students and everything. Again, generally a balance. It's the type of person you are, what works best for you. I mean, as a professor or a teaching assistant, you've had professors. You know what worked with you, what didn't work with you, what got you upset. And so you can take the bad and the good from all the professors that you've had previously and kind of meld that into your style. And your style is going to evolve over time. You're not going to teach the last class that you teach before you retire the exact same way you taught the first class when you started being professor or a teaching assistant. So again, take all this information, process it, come up with the best, ignore what's not going to work for you. So take care and see you next time.